Ambassador Saith stood near the tall windows of the Calliston 9 Summit Hall and watched the human delegation with the same tired frustration he had carried for years. His 4 eyes blinked slowly as the humans smiled and shook hands with every species in the room, offering kind words and warm gestures that meant absolutely nothing to a galaxy drowning in blood. The war between the Velthari Dominion and the Reshkai Collective had been burning for 42 standard years. It had swallowed entire star systems and turned beautiful green worlds into graveyards of ash and silence. 19 billion souls had already perished, and the number kept climbing with every passing cycle. Both sides were exhausted and desperate, and both sides had spent decades begging humanity to join them. And every single time, the humans said the same thing: "We prefer dialogue." Saith curled his long fingers around his drink and let out a slow hiss of air through his gills. And he had been assigned to this neutral world to convince the Terran Compact to lend its fleet and its resources to the Reshkai cause. But the humans never committed. They sent medical ships to war zones. They delivered food to refugee stations. They hosted peace talks that went nowhere. They smiled and nodded and did nothing that mattered. Most of the galaxy had come to the same conclusion about humanity. They were cowards. They were soft. They were a young species barely 400 years into spaceflight, with a modest navy and no superweapons. Their economy was strong, and their science was respectable, but they had no taste for war. The Velthari mocked them openly in diplomatic channels. The Reshkai pitied them quietly in private, and the dozen other species watching from the edges of the conflict simply ignored them. What none of them knew was that humanity had been doing something far more dangerous than fighting. They had been learning. Unremarkable station, orbiting Neptune, a woman named Yuki Tanaka sat in a dim room surrounded by screens. She was the Fleet Admiral of Terran Strategic Command, and she was 67 years old, with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that looked like they had not rested in decades. She held a cup of green tea in both hands and stared at the data flowing across her displays. Every Velthari weapon signature catalogued over 4 decades. Every Reshkai fleet movement tracked and predicted. Every communication protocol broken and decoded. Every supply line mapped. Every commander profiled. Every weakness identified and filed away in a system so vast that only the AI network called Meridian could process it all. Captain Arjun Malar stood behind her and waited. He was 38 years old, with dark skin and steady hands, and the quiet patience of a man who had spent 12 years embedded in listening posts across the conflict zone. He had lived among alien populations and learned their languages and earned their trust, and sent back intelligence reports that nobody in the galaxy suspected existed. 42 years of data, Tanaka said, without turning around. "Yes, Admiral," Malar replied. "Every ship, every base, every orbital defense platform, every ammunition depot. All of it." She took a slow sip of tea and said nothing for a long time. On the other side of the galaxy, the Velthari Dominion was making a decision that would change everything. High Commander Drevik of the Velthari 3rd Assault Fleet had grown tired of the humans and their neutrality. He believed they were secretly funneling supplies to the Reshkai through a colony world called Nova Esperanza. He had no real proof, but he did not need proof. He needed a message. Nova Esperanza was a small colony on the edge of Terran space. It was home to 1.2 million people who lived inside massive biodomes built on an airless moon. They were farmers and teachers and engineers and children. They had nothing to do with the war. They had never fired a weapon at anyone. Drevik ordered the strike anyway. The Velthari fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Nova Esperanza at dawn. They did not send a warning. They did not issue demands. They opened fire on the biodomes from orbit, and watched the transparent walls crack and shatter. The atmosphere inside rushed out into the vacuum of space and took everything with it. The people of Nova Esperanza died in minutes. Some were pulled into the void. Some suffocated as the air vanished around them. Some were crushed under falling debris. A few managed to reach emergency shelters, but most did not. Children reached for parents who could not reach back. Families were torn apart by decompression. The screams lasted only seconds, because sound cannot travel in a vacuum. When it was over, the Velthari fleet left without a word. The footage reached Earth within hours. Terran satellites hidden in the region had captured everything in perfect detail. Every cracking dome, every body floating in the silence of space, every child's face frozen in terror. The images spread through the Terran compact like fire through dry grass. On Neptune Station, Admiral Tanaka watched the footage on her screen. Her tea had gone cold in her hands. Captain Millar stood beside her, and his jaw was tight and his eyes were wet, but he said nothing. The room was full of officers and analysts, and not one of them made a sound. Tanaka set her cup down on the console. The soft click of ceramic against metal was the loudest thing in the room. She looked at the strategic display one more time. 42 years of preparation glowed on that screen. Every plan, every contingency, every target, every ship in position and waiting for the word. "Signal all commands," she said, and her voice was steady and calm, and carried the weight of a species that had chosen peace for as long as peace was possible. The officers straightened. Malar reached for the communication console. "Condition absoluto," Tanaka continued. "Activate Meridian across all networks. Full spectrum deployment. Authorization Tanaka 771. She paused and looked one final time at the frozen image of Nova Esperanza on her screen. A child's hand pressed against cracked glass, reaching for a sky that was no longer there. "We are done watching." The signal went out at the speed of light, and then faster, as it jumped through quantum relay stations hidden across human space. It reached every ship, and every station, and every listening post in the Terran compact. Captains opened sealed orders they had carried for years. Engineers powered up weapon systems that had never been fired. Pilots strapped into cockpits and waited for coordinates. And somewhere on Calliston 9, Ambassador Sayeth noticed that the human delegation had quietly left the summit hall. Were empty. Their shuttle was already gone. No announcement, no explanation, no farewell. He stared at the empty chairs and felt something cold crawl up his spine. He did not yet understand what it meant, but he would. The entire galaxy would, and it would only take 5 hours. In the first 60 minutes, after Admiral Tanaka gave the order, the entire Terran compact went dark, and the galaxy did not understand what it was seeing. Every human ship stopped transmitting. Every embassy closed its doors. Every trade station powered down its public communications. Every relay beacon that carried human signals went silent at the exact same moment, across thousands of light years. It was as if someone had reached into the stars and pulled out every thread that connected humanity to the rest of the galaxy. On Calliston 9, Ambassador Sayeth stood in the communication center of the Reshkai delegation and tried to reach the Terran embassy. Nothing. He tried their trade office. Nothing. He tried the personal frequency of the human ambassador he had shared drinks with just hours ago. Nothing but static. "What is happening?" he asked his aide. "We do not know, sir. All human frequencies are dead. Every single one." The other alien delegations were having the same experience. Diplomats crowded the hallways with confused faces and raised voices. The Korvathi ambassador suggested a technical malfunction. The Teshani delegate suspected a cyber attack. The Velthari representative smiled and said the humans had finally shown their true nature. "They are running. the Velthari diplomat declared loudly in the main hall. "We struck their little colony and now they flee. This is what cowardice looks like." Several delegates nodded. It made sense to them. Humanity was small and soft, and everyone knew they could not fight. The destruction of Nova Esperanza must have terrified them into retreat. The Velthari celebrated quietly among themselves, and sent word back to High Commander Drevik that the human problem had solved itself. They could not have been more wrong. 14 light-years from Caliston 9, Captain Arjun Malar stood on the bridge of the Terran warship Quiet Resolve and watched his crew work in total silence. Ship had shed its outer hull 6 hours before the order came, and now it looked nothing like the research vessel it had pretended to be for 7 years. Beneath the fake panels and civilian markings was a predator built for one purpose. Every ship in the Terran fleet was doing the same thing. Across human space, hundreds of vessels that had spent years disguised as merchant freighters and science platforms and humanitarian transports were revealing what they truly were. Cargo bays opened to show missile batteries, communication arrays unfolded into electronic warfare suites. Engine pods that had been running at 10% capacity roared to full power, and the ships leaped forward with speed that no one in the galaxy knew humans possessed. Because the Terran Compact had kept its greatest secret for over a century, they did not use standard galactic faster-than-light travel. The rest of the galaxy used fold drives that bent space in a way that created detectable ripples. Could see a fold drive coming from light-years away. Terran ships used something different, something they called phantom drives. They slipped through a layer of space that other species did not even know existed, and they arrived at their destination with zero warning and zero trace. For 42 years, the humans had used slow civilian fold drives in public, while their military trained with phantom drives in secret. Nobody suspected. Nobody even thought to look. On Neptune Station, Admiral Tanaka stood at the center of the command room and watched the strategic display. Project Meridian was fully online now. The AI network linked every Terran warship into a single living system. Each captain still made their own decisions, but Meridian fed them real-time intelligence and coordinated their movements with a precision that no organic mind could match. The display showed thousands of blue dots spreading across the galaxy like seeds scattered by a careful hand. Each dot was a strike group. Each strike group had a specific target assigned years in advance, and those targets were not cities. They were not civilian centers. They were not farm worlds or colonies. The targets were the things that made war possible. Command nodes where admirals gave orders, communication relays that carried those orders across space, fleet anchorages where warships refueled and rearmed, weapons foundries that built the instruments of death, flagship positions where the leaders who started and sustained the killing made their decisions. And the targets belonged to both sides. Not just the Velthari, who had destroyed Nova Esperanza. Not just the Reshkai, who had committed their own share of atrocities over 42 years. Both of them. Every military installation that kept this war alive was marked for simultaneous attack. Captain Malar reviewed his orders one final time. His strike group consisted of 12 ships, and their target was the Velthari Mobile. Command station called the Throne of Ashes. It was the nerve center of the entire Velthari war effort, and it was defended by over 200 warships. 12 against 200. Malar smiled. The Velthari did not know his ships existed. They did not know phantom drives existed. They did not know about cascade missiles or neural shielding or any of the weapons his ships carried. They were about to learn. "All ships," Malar said into the fleet channel. "Final check. Report readiness." 12 voices came back one by one, all green, all ready. Meridian sync confirmed, the AI reported in its calm, neutral voice. "All strike groups across all theaters report ready. Simultaneous drop in T-minus 4 minutes. 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, every single Terran strike group in the galaxy would drop out of Phantom Drive at the exact same instant. Thousands of ships appearing from nowhere at hundreds of locations across the conflict zone. The HFY Collective would be hit at once before either could warn the other. Malar looked around his bridge. His crew was young. Most of them had trained their entire careers for this moment, without knowing if it would ever come. The weapons officer was 26. The navigator was 30. The communications specialist was 24, and her hands were shaking slightly until she noticed him watching and steadied them with a deep breath. "Listen," Malar said, and his voice carried the quiet warmth of a man who understood what he was asking of them. "We are not here to destroy. We are here to stop. Disable their weapons, kill their engines, shut down their communications, but we do not fire on escape pods. We do not target medical ships. We do not shoot anyone who surrenders. That is not who we are, and that is not why we are here." His crew nodded. They understood. The countdown reached 0. Across 1,000 light-years of contested space, the Terran fleet dropped out of Phantom Drive at the exact same moment. Thousands of ships appeared from nothing in the heart of enemy formations. Beside orbital stations, above fleet anchorages, around communication relays, they came without warning, and without mercy, and without a single wasted movement. On Calliston 9, Ambassador Sayeth was sitting alone in his quarters, trying to make sense of the human silence, when every screen in the station lit up with emergency alerts. His communicators screamed with incoming signals from a dozen HFY outposts. All of them said the same thing. "Unknown ships, they came from nowhere. We are under attack." He rushed to the main communication center and found chaos. It was not just the HFY. The Velthari were sending the same messages. Both sides were being attacked simultaneously by ships that no one could identify. But Sayeth knew. He looked at the energy signatures on the tactical feeds, and he recognized the hull configurations from years of studying Terran merchant vessels. The shapes were different now, sharper and more dangerous. But the bones were the same. "It is the humans," he whispered. The Velthari diplomat who had laughed about human cowardice an hour ago stood frozen in the middle of the room, with his mouth open and his face drained of color. The galaxy held its breath, and the humans had finally stopped smiling. The first thing the Velthari defenders around the Throne of Ashes saw was nothing, and then they saw everything all at once. 12 Terran warships materialized inside their defensive perimeter, without a flash or a ripple, or any of the usual signs that a ship had just crossed faster than light. One moment, there was empty space, and the next moment, there were predators in the flock, and the flock did not even have time to panic. Captain Malar gave the order before the Velthari could react. Cascade volley on their outer formation, phantom torpedoes on the command ring. Electronic warfare, full spectrum, now. The quiet resolve shuddered as its weapons came alive. Cascade missiles streaked outward in spiraling patterns, and struck the space around the Velthari fleet, rather than the ships themselves. The missiles did not explode in the traditional sense. Instead, they detonated in a way that tore apart the local fabric of faster-than-light travel. The space around the Velthari fleet became a cage. Any ship that tried to engage its fold drive would tear itself apart. They were trapped in normal space with nowhere to run. The Velthari tried to fight. 200 warships turned their weapons on 12 Terran vessels and opened fire with everything they had. Plasma beams and kinetic rounds and guided torpedoes filled the void with light and fury. And none of it landed. Terran ships moved in ways that should not have been possible. Their phantom drives allowed micro-jumps of just a few hundred meters. They flickered in and out of normal space like ghosts, appearing in one place long enough to fire, and vanishing before return fire could reach them. The Velthari gunners were shooting at afterimages. "Target their weapons arrays," Malar ordered. "Engine second. Leave life support alone." His weapons officer worked with mechanical precision. Every shot from the Terran ships hit exactly where it was aimed. They did not fire at hulls, or bridges, or crew quarters. They hit gun turrets, and missile tubes, and engine nacelles. Ship after ship went dark, as their ability to fight was stripped away, but their ability to survive remained intact. Across the galaxy, the same scene played out in 100 different locations. Terran strike groups appeared from nowhere and dismantled military targets with surgical precision. They hit Reshkai communication relays and severed the telepathic amplifier network that allowed Reshkai commanders to coordinate across star systems. They hit Velthari fleet anchorages and disabled every warship at dock before a single one could launch. They hit weapons foundries and ammunition depots and orbital defense platforms. And they did it all without targeting a single civilian installation. This was the detail that confused every alien strategist who tried to understand what was happening. The humans were not waging total war. They were not bombing cities or poisoning atmospheres or cracking planets. They were conducting surgery on a galactic scale, cutting out the tumor of military infrastructure while leaving everything else alive. On the Reshkai homeworld, the military high command watched in disbelief as their war machine came apart. General Koth, who had led the Reshkai military for 20 years, slammed his fist against the tactical display and demanded answers that nobody had. "How?" he roared. "How do they have this technology? We have been monitoring them for decades. They had nothing." His intelligence chief could only stare at the screen and say, "They hid it. They hid all of it." The Reshkai tried something desperate. A fast attack fleet of 80 warships had been positioned near a quantum relay station, and they used it to jump toward the Sol system, toward Earth itself. If they could threaten the human homeworld, perhaps they could force the Terrans to pull back. The fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system and found hell waiting for them. Earth was surrounded by an orbital defense grid so dense and so layered that it looked like a second shell around the planet. Weapons platforms and shield generators and interdiction satellites formed a web of overlapping fields that covered every angle of approach. The grid had been built in secret over the course of a century, and it had enough firepower to stop a force 10 times the size of what the Reshkai had sent. The 80 Reshkai warships were disabled in 11 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Their weapons went dead and their engines went cold, and they drifted in the darkness between Mars and Jupiter, like fallen leaves on still water. And then the Terran defense stations broadcast a message to the stranded crews. "This is Terran Orbital Command. Your ships have been disabled. You are not in danger. Medical and rescue vessels are being dispatched to your position. If you have wounded, please signal on the following frequency. Prioritize your ship. You will be treated with dignity. You have our word." General Koth heard that transmission from across the galaxy, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt something he did not recognize. It took him a long moment to realize it was shame. Back at the Throne of Ashes, the battle was ending. Malor's 12 ships had disabled 173 Velthari warships, and the rest had surrendered. The massive command station itself was drifting without power to its weapons or engines, but its life support was still running because the Terrans had been careful not to touch it. "Boarding teams ready," Malor said. "We take the station. We secure the War Council. Nobody fires unless fired upon, and even then you use stun settings. I want prisoners, not corpses." The boarding was swift and precise. Terran Marines moved through the corridors of the Throne of Ashes in teams of 4. They wore powered armor that made them look like giants, and they carried weapons set to non-lethal frequencies. Velthari soldiers who fought were stunned and restrained. Those who surrendered were disarmed and escorted to holding areas where medics checked them for injuries. Malor himself walked onto the command deck of the Throne of Ashes and found the Velthari War Council sitting in their ornate chairs, staring at him with eyes full of rage and terror. High Commander Drevik, the one who had ordered the strike on Nova Esperanza, was among them. His golden armor was dull under the emergency lighting, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair so hard that his claws left marks in the metal. "You are all under arrest," Malor said calmly. "You will be charged with crimes against sentient life, including the destruction of the civilian colony of Nova Esperanza and the deaths of 1.2 million people. You will receive legal representation and a fair trial. You will not be harmed." Drevik stared at him for a long time, and then spoke in a whisper, voice that trembled with something between fury and disbelief. "You are a young species. You have been among the stars for only 4 centuries. How can you do this?" Malar looked at him with steady eyes, and answered with words that would be repeated across the galaxy for generations. "We have been among the stars for 4 centuries, but we have been fighting wars for 10,000 years. We got tired of it. We got good at ending them." Meanwhile, on every galactic communication frequency, a Terran broadcast was playing on loop. It was not a battle cry, or a threat, or a demand for surrender. It was a legal document, translated into every known language, and read in a calm, clear voice. It was a formal indictment of both the Velthari Dominion and the Reshkai Collective for crimes against sentient life. It listed specific atrocities, with dates and locations, and evidence. It cited Nova Esperanza and 47 other massacres committed by both sides. It named commanders and gave their ranks and detailed their orders. The humans were not just fighting a war, they were prosecuting one. On Caliston 9, Ambassador Saith listened to the broadcast with his mouth open and his 4 eyes wide. Around him, the alien delegation sat in stunned silence. The Korvathi ambassador had tears running down her face. The Tishani delegate was praying in a language Saith did not understand. A Velthari admiral, somewhere on the front lines, watched his fleet go dark, system by system, and whispered to his bridge crew words that would later be carved into the memorial at Nova Esperanza. They were never afraid to fight. They were waiting until they could win without becoming us. The war did not end with a great final battle, or a dramatic explosion, or a single decisive moment that historians could point to and say it happened right here. Instead, it ended the way a fever breaks, slowly and then all at once, as the body realizes it does not have the strength to keep burning. By the 3rd hour, the military infrastructure of both the Velthari Dominion and the Reshkai Collective had been gutted. Communication relays were dead. Command stations were captured or disabled. Fleet anchorages were cold and silent. The admirals and generals who had directed 42 years of carnage were either in Terran custody or stranded on powerless ships, unable to contact anyone. Individual fleet commanders across the conflict zone faced a choice that was no choice at all. They could fight blind against an enemy that saw everything and appeared from nowhere and could not be hit. Or they could accept the ceasefire transmissions that Terran ships were broadcasting on every frequency in every language on an endless loop. Most of them chose to stop fighting. Captains powered down their weapons and opened their airlocks and waited for the Terran boarding parties that arrived with medics and translators and water and food. Reshkai officers, who had spent their entire adult lives at war, sat on the decks of their own ships and watched human soldiers treat their wounded with gentle hands, and could not make sense of what they were seeing. Some did not surrender. A hardline Veltari faction called the Burning Fist refused the ceasefire, and gathered what ships they had into a desperate strike force. They launched biological weapons at a Terran carrier group near the Vesca Nebula. Pods filled with engineered plague organisms, designed to eat through hull metal and then through flesh. The Terrans saw them coming. Meridian had already calculated the probability of a biological attack and had positioned countermeasure ships in advance, intercepted the plague pods in open space, and neutralized them with focused radiation bursts. Not a single organism reached a Terran hull. Then the Terrans disabled every ship in the Burning Fist formation. They did not destroy them. They killed their engines and their weapons, and left them floating. And when Terran Marines boarded those ships, they found wounded Valthari soldiers, and they treated them first before securing the vessels. A young Terran medic knelt beside a Valthari warrior who had a piece of shrapnel lodged in his chest. The warrior looked up at her with eyes full of hatred and confusion. "Why?" he rasped. "We tried to kill you with plague. Why do you help me?" The medic did not look up from her work as she carefully sealed the wound. "Because you are hurt," she said simply, as if that was all the reason anyone would ever need. On Neptune Station, Admiral Tanaka had not slept and had not eaten, and the tea in her cup had been refilled and gone cold. 4 times, she stood in the command room and watched the galaxy change color on her display. Red zones turning yellow, turning green, as one by one the weapons went silent, and the killing stopped. At the 4-hour mark, she opened a direct communication channel to the captured leaders of both factions. The feed showed 2 rooms on 2 different ships. In one room, the Valthari War Council sat in restraints, with Terran guards standing quietly behind them. High Commander Drevik stared at the camera with murderous eyes. In the other room, General Koth of the Reshkai sat unrestrained in a simple chair, with his head bowed and his hands folded in his lap. Tanaka looked at both screens, and she did not gloat. She did not smile. She did not raise her voice. She looked exhausted and old and sad in a way that went deeper than her bones. 42 years, she said. 19 billion dead. 63 habitable worlds rendered uninhabitable. 2 entire species, the Kelvani and the Morthene, driven to total extinction because they had the misfortune of living in your war zone. Their songs are gone. Their languages are gone. Their children are gone. There is no one left to remember them, except those of us who bothered to notice. She paused and let the weight of those numbers fill the silence. I am not here to lecture you. I am here to tell you that it is over. This war ends today. It ends right now. And what comes next will be justice, not revenge, not occupation, not the kind of peace that is just a pause before the next war. Real justice, with evidence and trials, and the right to defend yourselves. That is what we are offering. That is the only thing we are offering. Drevik leaned forward against his restraints and snarled, You think you have the right to judge us. You are children playing at Empire. Tanaka looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a weariness that seemed to stretch across centuries. We are not playing at anything, Commander, and we are not children. We are a species that spent 10,000 years learning every possible way to destroy itself, and then decided to find a better use for that knowledge. You were right to underestimate us. It gave us the time we needed. General Koth raised his head slowly and spoke for the first time. What happens to our people? Not our soldiers, our civilians, our farmers and workers and children. Nothing happens to them, Tanaka replied. They were never our enemy. Humanitarian ships are already being dispatched to every affected world on both sides. Food and medicine and engineering teams. We did not come here to conquer your people, General. We came here to stop you from killing each other. Koth closed his eyes and nodded once, and said nothing more. Captain Malar was on the throne of ashes when the final holdouts surrendered. He had been awake for almost 20 hours, and his powered armor felt like it weighed twice what it should. Through the corridors of the captured station, and saw Velthari prisoners sitting in groups guarded by Terran Marines who handed out water bottles and ration packs. A Velthari officer approached him. She was older, with scars on her face and the insignia of a fleet commander on her collar. Her name was Sub-Commander Illith, and she had served in the war since its first year. I need to understand, she said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were searching. You could have done this years ago. Your weapons, your ships, your intelligence, You had the power to stop this war long before now. Why did you wait? Why did you let it go on for so long? Do you know how many died while you watched?" Malar looked at her, and the question hit him harder than any weapon could have, because he had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times in the quiet hours between missions. "We waited," he said slowly, "because we had to be sure we could stop it without starting something worse. If we had come in 10 years ago, with inferior preparation, we might have won the battles but lost the peace. We might have become just another faction fighting for territory. We might have become you." Ilith flinched at that. "And we waited," Malar continued, "because every single day we hoped you would stop it yourselves. Every day we gave you the chance to choose peace on your own. You never did, so here we are." She stared at him for a long time, and then she turned away and walked back to the other prisoners without another word. At exactly the 5-hour mark, Admiral Tanaka stood straight and pressed a single button on her console. A transmission went out on all frequencies across every known communication band, in every language catalogued by human linguists. It carried one word: enough. The word echoed across the galaxy, through warships and space stations, and planetary communication networks and personal receivers, and emergency channels. With a receiver heard it. One word in the voice of a tired old woman who had decided that the dying was done. And across 1,000 burning star systems, the guns fell silent. Not because the ammunition had run out, not because one side had conquered the other, but because someone had finally walked into the room and said the only word that mattered: enough. 6 weeks after the war ended, Ambassador Seath walked through the halls of the Calistan Tribunal and tried to recognize the galaxy he lived in. The same summit hall where he had watched the humans smile and shake hands was now a courtroom. The chairs where diplomats had traded empty words were filled with prosecutors and defense attorneys and witnesses and journalists from 40 different species. The room smelled like old paper and recycled air, and something else that Seath could not name. Something that felt like the first morning after a long illness. The Terran Compact had established the tribunal within days of the ceasefire. They modeled it on something from their own history, and they insisted on rules that many alien observers found baffling. Every accused war criminal, no matter how terrible their actions, would receive legal representation. Every piece of evidence would be presented publicly. Every defendant would have the right to speak in their own defense. Proceedings would be broadcast to every world in the galaxy. The Velthari delegation was furious. The idea that High Commander Drevik, the one who had shattered Nova Esperanza, would be allowed to speak and defend himself struck many as an insult to the dead. A Korvathi diplomat asked a human lawyer why they did not simply execute the worst offenders and be done with it. The lawyer, a young woman named Priya Santos, looked at the Korvathi with calm, steady eyes and said, "Because if we kill people without giving them a trial, then we are just faster murderers. Justice is not about what is easy. It is about what we can live with when we look back." Seath was called as a witness in the 3rd week. He testified about what he had seen during his years on Calistan 9, about the diplomatic failures and the missed chances for peace, and the slow grinding despair of watching a war consume everything it touched. He spoke about the moment the human delegation had quietly left the summit hall and how he had felt something cold in his spine without understanding why. When he stepped down from the witness stand, a human journalist approached him and asked how it felt to watch the species he had dismissed as cowards put an end to the greatest war in galactic history. Seath thought about the question for a long time before answering. "It feels like waking up and discovering that the quiet person in the corner of the room was the only one who knew the building was on fire, and instead of running, they spent years building a fire engine." The trials continued for months. High Commander Drevik was convicted of crimes against sentient life for the destruction of Nova Esperanza and 17 other atrocities. He was sentenced to life imprisonment on a neutral world. He never expressed remorse. General Koth of the Reshkai cooperated with the tribunal and provided testimony that helped convict dozens of officers on his own side. He was sentenced to 20 years. But many expected it would be reduced. He had become a different person in the weeks after the war, and those who knew him said the silence had broken something inside him that needed to be broken. Not everyone in the galaxy was grateful. Some species looked at what humanity had done and felt only terror. A coalition of smaller powers called the Threshold Compact issued a formal statement expressing concern over Terran military capabilities. They pointed out that a species capable of dismantling 2 galactic superpowers in 5 hours could do the same to anyone. The statement was polite, but the fear underneath it was raw and real. The Terrans understood. Admiral Tanaka, who had retired from active command 3 weeks after the war, addressed the concern directly in a public broadcast. "You are afraid of us," she said. "I understand. We walked into your galaxy and showed you that we had been hiding our true strength for centuries. That is frightening, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I ask you to look at what we did with that strength. We did not conquer. We did not enslave. We did not take territory or demand tribute. We stopped a war, and we put our weapons away. Fear us if you must. That is your right. But watch what we do next. Watch carefully, because what we do with peace will tell you more about us than what we did with war." Captain Malar did not attend the tribunal. He asked for leave and flew alone to the ruins of Nova Esperanza. The moon was still airless, and the shattered biodomes lay in pieces across the gray surface like broken eggshells. Terran engineering crews had already begun construction on a memorial, but the site was still raw and open to the void. Malar put on his pressure suit and walked among the ruins. He found the remains of a school, tiny desks crushed under fallen beams. A child's drawing still pinned to a wall that was now open to the stars. It showed a family standing under a yellow sun with green grass, their feet. The kind of picture that children draw everywhere in the galaxy because hope looks the same in every language. But he stood there for a long time and did not try to stop the tears that fogged the inside of his helmet. When the engineering crew asked if he wanted to help with the memorial, he said yes. They gave him a small pot containing a cherry blossom sapling that had been brought from Earth. He carried it into the first completed section of the new biodome and planted it in fresh soil that smelled like rain and beginnings. The tree was barely a foot tall, and its branches were thin and bare, but it would grow. Given time and care and sunlight, it would bloom pink and white, and remind everyone who saw it that life insists on continuing, even in places where death once had its way. Months passed. The galaxy slowly and painfully began to rebuild. Worlds that had been battlefields were being cleared of debris and replanted. Refugee populations that had been displaced for decades were returning to homes that no longer existed and building new ones from the rubble. It was hard and slow and full of grief, but it was happening. The Terran fleet that had ended the war in 5 hours transformed itself again. Warships were refitted as hospital ships and engineering platforms and cargo haulers. The same phantom drives that had carried missiles now carried medicine and building materials and teachers. Terran aid convoys arrived at devastated worlds on both sides of the former conflict, and they did not ask which faction the inhabitants had supported. They simply asked what was needed and then provided it. Sayeth watched all of this from his new post as the Reshkai liaison to the Terran reconstruction effort. He worked alongside human aid workers every day, and he began to understand them in a way that 42 years of diplomacy had never allowed. They were not saints. They argued and complained and got tired and made mistakes. Families and ate terrible food and told bad jokes and sometimes lost their tempers. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary work because someone had asked them to, and they had said yes. One evening, after a long day of coordinating supply deliveries to a devastated Reshkai colony, Sayeth sat in his quarters and tried to write a report to the new Reshkai civilian government. They wanted him to explain humanity, to describe what kind of species could hide its power for centuries, and then use it not to conquer, but to heal. They wanted a word for what the humans were. He tried a dozen different terms in the Reshkai language, and none of them fit. Warrior was wrong, because warriors seek battle, and the humans had avoided it for as long as they could. Guardian was wrong, because guardians protect their own, and the humans had protected everyone. Liberator was wrong, because they had not freed anyone from oppression, but from a war that both sides had chosen to fight. Remembered an old Reshkai word from a dialect that few people spoke anymore. It had no direct translation into any other language, but it meant something close to the ones who carry fire, but choose to build hearths. He wrote the word at the top of his report, and spent the rest of the night trying to explain it. The last image in the story was not of a battle or a courtroom or a speech. It was of a Terran aid ship arriving at a small Velthari farming world that had been caught in the crossfire 15 years ago. The fields were scorched and the water was poisoned, and the people who remained were thin and tired and had forgotten what it felt like to expect anything good. The ship landed and its doors opened, and out came engineers with water purifiers, and agronomists with seed banks, and doctors with medicine, and teachers with books. A human woman with dirt under her fingernails and smile lines around her eyes knelt down in front of a Velthari child who was watching from behind a broken wall with wide, frightened eyes. She held out her hand and waited. She did not grab or pull or demand. She just held out her hand and waited with the same patience that her species had shown for 42 years before the war, and 5 hours during it, and every single day after. The child looked at her hand for a long time, and then slowly, carefully reached out and took it. The galaxy had always wondered what would happen when the humans finally went to war. Now they knew, and now they watched in awe and trembling to see what the humans would do with the peace. And the humans, as they always had, simply rolled up their sleeves and got to work.